Everyone knows the term cheating death, the idea of slipping through the icy grip of mortality, evading the inevitable. It's a phrase laced with both hope and dread, for everyone understands that death, relentless and patient, always catches up in the end. Some manage to escape for years, even decades, while others are not so fortunate. I cheated death once. It hasn't caught up to me yet, but it will. Before it does, I want to share a story. Not mine, though. This tale belongs to another, a young man whose fate intertwined with forces far darker than he could comprehend. His story deserves to be remembered, even as mine fades into oblivion. It begins in the cold, shadowed reaches of Washington, where a 19-year-old named Lyle lay dying. His body was ravaged by acute leukemia, a merciless disease that consumed him with terrifying speed. His family wept at his bedside, their sorrow a haunting chorus that echoed through the sterile hospital halls. Lyle, desperate and broken, begged for mercy, not from the doctors, but from God. He prayed for more time, for just a few more moments to hold his loved ones, to breathe, to live. But no divine answer came. One night, as the thin thread of his life unraveled, Lyle drifted in and out of consciousness. His breaths were shallow, his strength all but gone. Then, as the clock struck midnight, a figure emerged from the shadows of his room. The man was tall and lean, dressed in a sharp black suit that seemed to absorb the light. A dark gray shirt peeked beneath his jacket, a white handkerchief tucked neatly into the pocket. His raven black fedora obscured his eyes, but his sneer, twisted and unnatural, was impossible to miss. In his hand, he twirled a cane tipped with a jewel that shimmered like a frozen flame. "Ah, what do we have here?" The man's voice was a chilling rasp, deep and laced with mockery. "It seems your little illness is getting the better of you." Lyle's eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion. The man loomed over him, his presence suffocating. Who are you?" Lyle whispered, his voice barely audible. "Originally?" The man chuckled darkly. "I came here to kill you. But let's call me a savior, shall we? I've come to end your suffering." However, he leaned closer, his grin widening. "Your pitiful cries for mercy intrigued me. So I've decided to offer you a deal." Lyle's heart pounded weakly in his chest. "A deal?" "I can give you what you want," the man continued, his tone dripping with boredom. "More time, a chance to live, to see your family again. But," his voice sharpened, "there's a price. An eye for an eye, as they say." The man snapped his fingers, and a scroll materialized in a burst of blue flame. It hovered in the air, bound with a crimson ribbon. Beside it, a crow's feather floated, black as midnight. "Sign this," the man said, his voice a low growl. "Your soul for your life. A simple exchange." Lyle stared at the scroll, his vision blurring. The words seemed to writhe on the parchment, written in a language he didn't understand. "You don't have much time," the man warned, his patience wearing thin. "The last grain of sand is about to fall. Decide, boy." Lyle hesitated. The man's offer reeked of deceit, yet the alternative was certain death. His fingers trembled as he reached for the feather. "Good choice," the man hissed, his grin now impossibly wide. And as Lyle signed his name, the room seemed to darken, the air growing heavy with an unseen presence. The man's laughter echoed in his ears, cold and cruel. "You'll live, Lyle," the man said, his voice fading into the shadows. "But remember, death always collects its debts." From that moment on, Lyle's life was never the same. He had cheated death, but at what cost? Lyle's trembling hand hovered over the scroll, the crow's feather gripped tightly between his fingers. With a deep breath, he began to sign, his name taking shape on the ancient parchment. Halfway through his signature, the man interrupted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, I almost forgot to mention," he said, his grin widening. "By signing this contract, you're not just giving me your soul. I'm also granted control over your physical being. In other words, He leaned in, his breath cold as frost. "I own you." Before Lyle could react, the scroll ignited in a blaze of blue flames, vanishing before his eyes. The room erupted in chaos. The walls seemed to pulse and twist, and the air filled with a deep, guttural hum. "What's happening? What are you doing?" Lyle's voice cracked with panic, but the man simply stepped back, his grin never faltering. The shadows in the room thickened, coalescing into a dark, viscous substance that slithered toward Lyle like a living thing. It wrapped around his legs, climbing higher with unnatural speed. "Stop, please!" Lyle screamed, but his cries were drowned out by the substance as it engulfed him. The black mass burned like acid, searing his skin and burrowing into his flesh. Lyle writhed in agony, his screams turning into muffled gurgles as the substance forced its way into his mouth and down his throat. It invaded his eyes, blinding him with searing pain, and he could feel it crawling through his veins, corrupting him from the inside out. The man stood in the corner, his figure illuminated by the eerie blue glow of the flames. He watched with cold amusement, tipping his fedora in a mock farewell as he disappeared into the fire. Lyle's body convulsed violently before collapsing onto the bed. His vision faded to black, and his screams were silenced. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was a single piece of paper fluttering to the floor. The words "Rest in Peace" scrawled across it in blood-red ink. 6 months later, Lyle was released from the hospital. His body had healed, but his soul felt hollow, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of time could fill. His parents, relieved to see him alive, tried to move on, but fate had other plans. One fateful evening, as the family drove through a busy intersection, a speeding car ran a red light. The collision was catastrophic. The vehicle spun out of control, crashing into a concrete wall that supported an elevated toll road. Lyle survived, but his parents were killed on impact. At their funeral, beneath a gray, weeping sky, Lyle noticed a familiar figure lurking in the distance. The man from the hospital stood among the graves, his black suit pristine, his fedora casting a shadow over his face. Lyle approached him, rage and sorrow boiling within. You did this, why?" The man smirked, his expression devoid of sympathy. "It was necessary, their time was up. Necessary." Lyle's voice cracked as tears streamed down his face. "They were innocent. What could you possibly gain from this?" The man's eyes gleamed with malice. "You'll be better off without them. Besides," he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper, "it makes your next job easier." "Job?" Lyle's voice trembled. The man straightened, his demeanor turning cold and businesslike. "Yes, your job. Since your soul belongs to me, you're now bound to my service. You'll be what I call a ghastly reaping archangel, or as most people would say, a grim reaper." Lyle's heart sank. "You're joking." "Oh, I never joke," the man said, his tone deadly serious. "Your task is simple. Collect the souls of the dying. It doesn't matter who they are, strangers, friends, the good, the wicked. Everyone has a time limit, and when that time is up, you'll be there to ensure they don't cheat death. If you fail, they'll get a temporary reprieve, but you'll feel the consequences." Lyle's fists clenched, his mind racing with fear and anger. "And if I refuse?" The man chuckled darkly. "You can't refuse. You signed the contract. You belong to me now." With those words, the man vanished, leaving Lyle standing alone among the graves. The weight of his new reality pressed down on him, and he realized that in cheating death, he had sealed his fate in something far worse. Lyle's head spun with the weight of death's words. The antique watch dangled from death's bony fingers, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The blue flames on its hands flickered like malevolent spirits trapped within the timepiece. "This isn't just any watch," Death said, his voice low and cold. "It holds the lifetime of a soul. Once the hands begin their journey, they will not stop until the cycle is complete. You have until the flames extinguish to collect the soul. If you fail—" He paused, his grin sharp and humorless. "They get an extension, and I hate giving away free time." Lil swallowed hard, his throat dry. "How am I supposed to know who to take? How will I find them?" Death's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming like twin voids. "Oh, you'll know. The moment you see them, you'll feel it. Their life will call out to you, begging to be taken. Your job begins at nightfall." Without another word, Death turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing like the tolling of a bell. "I'll be watching," he called over his shoulder, his voice dripping with sinister amusement. "Don't disappoint me." Lyle returned home, his mind reeling. He collapsed onto the couch, throwing an arm over his face as he tried to process the nightmare that had become his reality. Exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. The night was heavy, the moon casting a cold silver glow through the windows. In the silence, footsteps echoed across the floor, growing louder as they approached. "Wake up, you fool. It's time." Lyle shot upright, his heart pounding. He scanned the room, but it was empty. The voice had been so close, so real. Before he could make sense of it, a cold, bony hand grabbed him by the hair, yanking his head back. "Stop squirming," Death hissed, his voice chillingly calm. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Lyle's body froze as he felt something sharp press against his throat. His eyes darted around, desperate for an escape, but Death loomed over him, his presence suffocating. "This is your first night of reaping," Death continued. "To ensure you don't screw it up, I've decided to oversee your transformation." Before Lyle could protest, Death snapped his fingers. A searing pain exploded in his eyes. He clawed at his face, gasping as black slime oozed from his tear ducts and mouth, its acrid stench filling his nostrils. "What did you do to me?" Lyle choked, his voice raw with panic. Death tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Just a precautionary measure," he said, his tone disturbingly nonchalant. "Now hold still." Lyle's screams echoed through the room as Death's cold fingers plunged into his eye sockets. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that made his entire body convulse. Death worked with meticulous precision, his bony digits digging deeper until they latched onto the inside of Lyle's skull. With a sickening squelch, Death yanked Lyle's right eye free. Blood and black slime poured from the empty socket, burning his skin as it flowed down his face. Lyle gagged, his body racked with violent shudders. "You can't die," Death murmured, almost soothingly. "Not anymore. I won't allow it." He tossed the eye to the ground, where it rolled to a stop, staring lifelessly at its former owner. Without hesitation, Death turned his attention to the left eye. He pulled out a gleaming blade, its edge impossibly sharp, and made 2 precise cuts across the sclera. Lyle's screams grew weaker, his voice hoarse from the torment. The blade glinted in the moonlight as Death worked, his movements as methodical as a surgeon's. "It's necessary," Death said, his voice soft but firm. "You'll thank me later." When the ordeal was over, Lyle lay motionless, his body trembling with residual pain. Death stood over him, wiping the blade clean with a handkerchief. "Now," he said, his tone brisk and businesslike, "your real work begins." He stepped back, his figure fading into the shadows. "Don't disappoint me," he whispered, his voice lingering in the air long after he was gone. Lyle's vision was gone, but in the darkness, he could feel something new, a presence, cold and unrelenting, pulsing within him. He wasn't alone. He would never be alone again. Lyle fought with every ounce of strength he had, clawing and thrashing against the cold, unyielding grip of death. But it was useless. His struggles only amused the ancient entity. Death finally released him, letting him collapse to the floor like a broken marionette. Lyle curled into a trembling ball, his hands clutching his face as hot, sticky blood seeped between his fingers. The once pristine white carpet beneath him was now a grotesque canvas, painted with streaks of crimson. He gagged, sputtering as the metallic taste overwhelmed his senses. Death didn't stop there. The blade danced cruelly around Lyle's mouth, carving into his gums and lips with surgical precision. Each cut was deliberate, each wound a mark of ownership. Lyle's screams were reduced to gurgles as he choked on the blood and black slime that continued to ooze from his eyes and mouth. He writhed on the floor, his body convulsing in agony. The dark substance burned his skin, leaving trails of scorched flesh in its wake. Death rose to his feet, his hollow gaze fixed on the pitiful figure before him. "You'll heal," he said coldly, settling into the couch with a detached air. "Eventually." Lyle's mind raced with questions. Why was this happening? Why did death promise him a second chance only to subject him to such torment? His thoughts spiraled into despair, but the cold, unfeeling stare of death brought him back to reality. "This isn't personal," Death said after a long silence. "Consider it preparation. You see, mercy has no place in your new role. I've taken your sight, your voice, your humanity. Now there's nothing left to betray you." Lyle groaned, his body trembling as Death leaned closer. "The black sludge you're coughing up?" Death continued. "It's seeping into your mind, stripping away your emotions. When the time comes, you'll make the right choices. No hesitation. No guilt." Death's skeletal hand wrapped bandages around Lyle's mangled face, the bindings rough and hastily applied. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "Now you're ready." With a snap of his fingers, Death vanished, leaving Lyle alone in the blood-soaked room. His body ached, his throat burned, and his mind reeled. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, swaying unsteadily as a strange compulsion took hold. His hand reached out instinctively, finding the cold surface of the pocket watch. Though he couldn't see it, he felt the faint warmth of the blue flame within. A sense of purpose, alien and unyielding, flooded his mind. The watch guided him, whispering the location of his first target. Lyle moved with unnatural speed, his body gliding across the ground like a shadow given form. The bandages over his eyes did little to hinder him. The watch was his guide now. He arrived at a decrepit apartment complex, his breath ragged as he climbed the fire escape. Perching on the edge of a second-story window, he pressed his head against the glass. Inside, he heard the rasp of a cough, followed by the shuffle of heavy footsteps. A man appeared, a cigar clenched between his teeth, his face twisted into a scowl. The man's eyes narrowed as he spotted the shadowy figure outside the window. "What the hell are you doing here?" he growled, his voice thick with menace. "Get lost before I come out there and deal with you myself." Lyle said nothing. His mouth was bound, his tongue mutilated, his voice stolen. He tilted his head, studying the man with a detached curiosity. The watch in his hand pulsed, its flame growing stronger. Lyle knew, deep in the hollow void where his humanity once resided, that this man's time had come. The man stepped closer, his anger mounting. "You deaf or just stupid?" I said get. Before he could finish, Lyle moved. The window shattered, and the man's scream was swallowed by the night. The man's presence filled the room like a smothering weight. It wasn't his body Lyle was after, it was his soul. I said get the hell out of here. The man shouted, his voice sharp with irritation as he took heavy, deliberate steps toward Lyle. Lyle didn't respond. His body moved on instinct, driven by something far beyond his own will. With an unnatural speed, he lunged forward, shattering the window into 1,000 jagged shards. The sound echoed through the night, followed by a muffled thud as glass rained onto the floor. "Hey, keep it down up there. People are trying to sleep, you expletive." A neighbor yelled from the low ... Neither Lyle nor the man acknowledged the complaint. "You son of a expletive." The man spat, his face twisted with rage. He bolted toward the kitchen, reaching for a drawer where his weapon lay hidden. But Lyle was faster. Without hesitation, Lyle grabbed the man, twisting him around with inhuman strength, and slammed him into the wall. The impact left a gaping hole, drywall crumbling to the floor. Adrenaline coursed through Lyle's veins, but beneath it, a flicker of hesitation gnawed at him. This isn't right. Yet, as much as the thought tried to anchor him, another feeling stirred, a dark, exhilarating satisfaction. For a brief moment, it felt good to unleash his anger, to let his rage consume him. The man groaned, staggering to his feet. "Who the hell do you think you?" His words faltered as he finally got a clear look at Lyle's face. The bloodied bandages, the grotesque injuries, they froze him in place, his anger replaced by sheer horror. The man turned and fled, stumbling down the stairs in a blind panic. Lyle didn't chase him immediately. Instead, he stood motionless, checking his pocket watch. The flame inside burned faintly, whispering that there was still time. He didn't want to do this. He approached the shattered window, gazing down to see the man coughing violently in the cold night air. A strange pity flickered within him, but it was fleeting. The compulsion to complete his task clawed at his mind, an unrelenting force that drowned out all reason. Lyle leapt from the window, landing with eerie silence a few yards in front of the man. The man's head snapped up, his face pale and slick with sweat. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking as neighbors peeked out from their windows. The man took a shaky step back, then another, before deciding to face his fate head-on. With a desperate yell, he lunged at Lyle, swinging wildly. But Lyle was no longer human. He moved like a phantom, effortlessly dodging each strike. It was almost playful, like a predator toying with its prey. The man's fist finally connected, a solid blow to Lyle's face. He staggered but didn't fall. The man followed up with another punch, this time to Lyle's temple, forcing him to his knees. The man laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound. "You're just a freak, a pathetic, broken bastard." Lyle's fists clenched, his body trembling with a fury that wasn't entirely his own. His arms shook violently, and the air around him grew heavy. The man's laughter faltered as the shadows around them seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally across the ground. "What the hell?" the man whispered, stepping back as the darkness coiled around his feet like living tendrils. From the shadows crawled an army of grotesque creatures. Cockroaches, centipedes, and beetles swarmed over the man's legs, while moths fluttered around his face. He screamed, swatting and stomping, but the more he fought, the more they multiplied. Lyle began to laugh, a guttural, blood-choked sound that sent shivers down the man's spine. Blood seeped through the bandages on Lyle's face, dripping onto his clothes and pooling at his feet. What the hell are you?" the man screamed, his voice raw with terror. Lyle stood, his movements slow and deliberate. His hands trembled as they reached for his face, scratching at the blood-soaked bandages. The fabric began to unravel, revealing glimpses of torn flesh and hollow, bleeding eyes. The man froze, paralyzed by the grotesque sight before him. The bugs swarmed over his body, biting and burrowing into his skin. The shadows around him thickened, clinging to his legs like tar. "Stay away," the man shrieked, stumbling back. "Stay the hell away from me, you freak." But there was no escape. Lyle's presence loomed over him, a suffocating force that consumed everything in its path. The man's screams faded into the night, swallowed by the growing darkness. And then there was silence. Lyle's laughter died in his throat, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Slowly, he lowered his hands, revealing his ruined face. Blackened veins pulsed beneath his pale, torn skin, glowing with an eerie teal light. From beneath the bandages over his left eye, a piercing red glow burned, unblinking. The man froze in terror before instinct took over, and he turned to flee, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the empty street. Lyle stood motionless for a moment, his body trembling with barely contained rage. Then, slowly, methodically, he began to follow. The man glanced back as he ran, expecting to see Lyle far behind. But there he was, impossibly close, his slow, deliberate steps keeping pace. The man's heart pounded as darkness seemed to close in around him, swallowing the world whole. Something cold and slimy wrapped around his ankle, and he fell hard onto the asphalt. Dazed, he looked up and wished he hadn't. A spectral figure hovered before him, faintly glowing with a sickly teal light. Its face was a grotesque mask of decay, with hollow sockets glowing red like embers. Its skeletal arms stretched toward him, flesh hanging in rotted tatters. The man scrambled backward, but more phantoms emerged from the shadows, their distorted forms wheezing and gasping as they closed in. "Leave me alone," the man screamed, tears streaming down his face as the poltergeists swarmed around him. Bugs crawled over his skin, their tiny legs sending shivers of revulsion through his body. A shadow moved through the chaos, a figure walking toward him with slow, measured steps. "Stay back. Stay the expletive back," the man shrieked, his voice cracking. The figure chuckled softly, the sound low and guttural. Then, without warning, it lunged, soaring through the air like a predator pouncing on its prey. The man barely managed to throw himself aside as a massive curved blade, attached to a chain, slammed into the ground where he had just been. Lyle landed gracefully, his glowing red eye fixed on his target. He raised his arm, and a dark, smoky substance swirled around his hand, solidifying into a long staff. The chain and blade snapped back toward him, attaching to the staff with a metallic clang. As the smoke faded, Lyle stood holding a scythe as tall as himself, its curved blade gleaming wickedly in the dim light. He studied the weapon for a moment, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his bloodied lips. It felt right in his hands, like it had always been meant for him. The man's ragged breaths filled the air as he stumbled down the empty street, his body screaming for rest. But Lyle was already there, cutting him off with inhuman speed. Inches from the man's face, Lyle reached out, his bloodied hand brushing against the man's jawline. The man's scream caught in his throat as his body began to wither. His muscles shrank, his skin rotted, and his eyes sank deep into their sockets. His very essence seemed to drain away under Lyle's touch. Desperation gave him one final surge of strength, and he slapped Lyle's hand away, staggering backward. As he ran, his body miraculously restored itself, the damage undone in seconds. But there was no time to celebrate. Two blinding headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the street. A car barreled toward him at full speed, the engine roaring like a beast. The man barely had time to scream before the car struck him, sending his body flying through the air. He landed with a sickening crunch, skidding across the asphalt until he came to a broken, bloodied stop. The car didn't slow, disappearing into the night as if it had never been there. Somehow the man was still alive, his mangled body twitching weakly on the ground. Lyle approached, his scythe dragging along the pavement with a metallic scrape. The man's shattered ribs rose and fell as he struggled to breathe. "Why?" the man croaked, his voice barely audible over the sound of approaching sirens. "It's just business," Lyle replied, his voice raspy and broken. With one swift motion, the scythe sliced through the man's neck. Blood sprayed in an arc, painting the street in crimson. Lyle stood over the lifeless body, his hands trembling. His glowing eye flickered as his breath came in shallow gasps. For a moment, he stared at the gruesome scene, his mind blank except for the dull roar of his own heartbeat. Then, as the first neighbors began to spill into the street, he melted into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but blood and silence. Lyle had never killed anyone before. The first time was a paradox, a surge of exhilaration, and a crushing wave of revulsion. He hated it. He hated that he had become a killer, but it was his job now. Fighting against it would be futile, a battle he would lose over 1,000 lifetimes. Yet, a part of him liked it. For once, he had something to channel his anger into. Something tangible, something alive. If he could still smile, he might have. A faint glow appeared over the chest of the lifeless man before him, right where his heart should be. The light intensified, swirling and twisting into a vibrant teal orb. The soul. Lyle reached out, his hand trembling, and grasped it. For a moment, it pulsed against his palm, almost alive, almost pleading. Then, with a single merciless squeeze, he extinguished it. "What's going on over there?" Lyle turned sharply. A group of people had begun to gather, their curious eyes scanning the dimly lit street. He looked back at the body. The gaping wound in the man's chest had vanished, leaving only the blood a perfect illusion of death by accident. Without hesitation, Lyle fled into the shadows, his scythe dissolving into smoke. He climbed a fire escape of a nearby building, perching atop the roof to watch the chaos unfold. The first screams echoed below as the crowd discovered the mangled corpse. Voices rose in panic, calling for ambulances and police. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they would be too late. There was nothing to save. Behind him, footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. "Well done," a voice said, punctuated by slow, mocking applause. Lyle turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows. Death himself. The specter stepped into the faint light, his skeletal face twisting into a sardonic grin. "You've done quite a number here, haven't you?" Death's hollow eyes flicked toward the growing crowd. Stirred up a bit of trouble, though. "You weren't supposed to make such a scene." Lyle flinched at the reprimand, his body tensing. Death chuckled darkly. "Still, not bad for your first time. Looks like you had fun, though maybe a little too much fun." The words cut deeper than Lyle expected. Fun? Was that what this was? The thought made him sick. He wanted to protest, to explain, but his damaged throat allowed only a guttural rasp. "Ah, I know you'd like to speak," Death said, waving a bony hand dismissively. "But I've no interest in your groveling or your excuses. You're angry, I get it. I was too when I took this job. But you're not alone. There are others like you Grim Reapers, all bound to this wretched task." Death's form began to shimmer, blue flames licking at his edges. "Remember, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. Do your job, Gray." "Lyle," he growled, his voice harsh and broken. "My name is Lyle." Death smirked. "Not in my book." With that, he vanished, leaving Lyle alone on the rooftop. Below, paramedics loaded the body into an ambulance. The crowd's horrified murmurs carried on the wind, but Lyle turned away. His head hung low, his thoughts spiraling. What had he become? The rush he'd felt earlier, was that pleasure? And those powers, those unnatural abilities, where had they come from? Time blurred after that night. Hours became days, days became months, and months bled into years. Lyle, now known only as Gray, threw himself into his grim work. One by one, lives ended in his wake. Obituaries filled with vague causes of death, heart attacks, strokes, accidents. Yet, every corpse bore the same mark, a faint splatter of blood over the chest, with no visible wound to explain it. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered of a serial killer. Others spoke of divine punishment or a devil's curse. But the truth was far worse. It was the Grim Reaper himself, Gray, the one who stole souls from the brink of death. I know this because I survived him. I'm the only one who ever has. When Gray came for me, he asked a question. If you were to die by my hand, what would your last words be? I thought long and hard, knowing I'd never get another chance to speak. Finally, I asked, what happened to you? What made you this way? For the first time, his glowing red eye softened. In a voice heavy with sorrow, he told me his story. Now I pass it on to you. Gray wasn't always a monster. He didn't choose this path. And though the world may fear him, I can't help but pity him. Still, I know he'll return for me someday. When he does, I won't escape again. Before he left, he whispered the words that haunt me still. It's just business.